Just before the member proceeds with his call, we are on the purpose clause, which is clause 3. I'm not getting at anybody in part. I think we've progressed slightly to quite a broad debate, and I wish to not have it extend any further in terms, because there are only two clauses or two parts to this purpose clause. Members should just have a look at them. There will be ample opportunity as we progress through parts 1, etc., to get into the broader parameters of what this bill is about. So it's just a wee heads up. Thank you. Clayton Cosgrove.
I appreciate the advice, Mr Chair. Mr Chair, I wasn't in the chamber when the first reading of this bill went through, but I want to make a couple of comments, bearing in mind your advice, sir, regarding the purpose clause of this bill that's proposed. Because it says, at its essence, to deny parole to certain repeat offenders and to offenders guilty of the worst murders. Then it goes on in B, to impose maximum terms of imprisonment on persistent repeat offenders who continue to commit serious violent offences. Now, on the face of that, and I think the debate in the community that Mr Garrett's referred to, on the face of that, it'd be reasonably hard to argue with some of those sentiments until you delve into the detail. And the problem with these sorts of debates, sir, whether it be simply about the purpose, is that those of us who oppose the... Well, I'll say this. Firstly, I've never been a victim, ever. And as such, I have to be careful as a politician in dealing with, even if it is just the purpose, that we are not as politicians pontificating to those people who have been and are victims of heinous crime. And I acknowledge that. And I also acknowledge that in this debate, had my partner or my family been dealt to in the way that many in our community have been, through tragic circumstances and heinous crime, I suspect I would be less logical, more emotional, and possibly more extreme in my attitude. And I accept that, because the closer it gets to one's home, the more personal it is, and of course the bigger impact it does have. But here in the chamber, we're actually charged with trying to piece together, with the best will in the world, good, solid legislation that has a positive effect. And I would wager and take a political risk in saying that I suspect, putting aside the argument that if you're not an extremist and a hardliner, you're soft on crime, or if you're interested in reform, you're soft on crime, putting aside that sort of drivel, which we hear often in this chamber, I suspect that I would wager there probably wouldn't be one member of Parliament on either side of this House who does not, putting the political claptrap aside, does not care for victims, does not believe that the guilty should be punished, but also that their behaviour should be changed and they should be rewired, and doesn't want to pass effective legislation that actually works. And as we look at the purpose clause, the problem that the Labor opposition, I'm sure as we go through this debate, sadly, we'll have the usual sort of, oh, you know, if you're opposed to this, you're a hand-wringing liberal who's soft on crime, but sadly that's probably where it'll go, because it's degenerated into that right through this debate. So those of us who are opposed to this purpose clause and this piece of legislation are opposed to it because we do not believe it will work. We do not believe it will have the effect that its promoters suggest it will. We do believe that this purpose clause, along with every other clause in this bill, is more about political posturing, is more about bluntly tugging at the heartstrings of victims, raising the expectations of victims, and in the years to come, I suspect, we or maybe others will be in this place looking at what this debate was about and what, well, you see, there we go. That's my point proved, given the utterances from that member. And we'll be back here looking at this, either amending or disposing of it, because it won't have had the effect, either in deterrent or the practical effect its supporters and promoters say it will. I'm sure we could dredge out, and I bow to Mr Garrett being a lawyer, I'm sure we could dredge out all sorts of statistics from all sorts of places, and that has been done on both sides of this debate, about whether, as in point A of the purpose clause, the denial of parole to repeat offenders, whether that will have the practical effect that the promoters want in terms of deterring crime, and I presume, if we're about any substance, changing people's behaviour. But it's interesting that a judge, Mr Garrett quoted an American judge. We had an American judge to our caucus, and I think Judge Hyman, I think he was around the country, as a judge in California who had actually administered the Californian version of this law. And whilst acknowledging Mr Garrett's point that you're not going to get a life sentence for stealing a stick of gum, I accept that, Judge Hyman actually said, in his experience of administering the law, whereas in the purpose clause you have aspects of denying parole and imposing maximum sentences, his thesis was it didn't work. And we'll back what works and we'll oppose what doesn't.
I call Cam Calder.
Thank you, Mr